soft ambient sounds of a modern campus. Footsteps, distant laughter, a bike whirring past. Bright shots of a present-day university. Students under trees, laptops open, coffee cups, backpacks. On any given weekday, a university campus feels like one of the safest places on earth. A bubble. A world carefully sealed off from real life. Homework. Friendships. Late nights. Deadlines. Most students worry about grades, not gunfire. About roommates, not riot police. About midterms, not mass shootings. But in the 1960s and 70s, these quiet lawns and lecture halls became something else. A stage for bombings, sniper fire, deadly protests, and everyday crimes that nobody bothered to count. Aerial shot of the University of Texas Tower. National Guard facing students at Kent State. Broken windows at a bombed campus building. Panicked students running. This is the story of how American campuses, built to educate and protect, became crime scenes. Not just once, not just in one place, but again and again. While an entire generation tried to decide what kind of country they wanted to live in. To understand campus crime in the 60s and 70s, you have to start with the lie everybody believed in the 50s. The lie that everything was calm. After World War II, universities expanded. The GI Bill opened doors for thousands of veterans. Colleges became bigger, busier, and more important than ever. They were supposed to be places of opportunity and order. The civil rights movement challenged segregation and white supremacy. Televisions beamed images of police violence into living rooms. At the same time, Cold War paranoia and fear of communism simmered beneath the surface. Then, in the early 1960s, another storm rolled onto campus, the Vietnam War. University campuses had always been places for ideas. In the 60s, they became places for conflict over those ideas. Young people questioned the draft, the war, racism, the role of the university itself. Suddenly, the campus wasn't just a place to learn about politics. It became a place to make politics. Behind the headlines, something else was happening too, quieter, less dramatic, but just as real. Theft, assault, sexual violence, drugs. Ordinary crime existed on campus long before anyone thought to track it properly. But in an era of upheaval, this hidden layer of danger was easy to ignore. On August 1, 1966, at the University of Texas at Austin, the illusion of safety shattered. 25-year-old Charles Widman, an engineering student and ex-Marine, took rifles and ammunition up into the university's clock tower. He had already killed his wife and his mother. Now, from more than 300 feet above campus, he began shooting. For about an hour and a half, Widman fired at students, staff, and anyone who crossed his sights. 14 people died that day. Dozens were wounded. This was something new, a mass shooting in broad daylight, on a college campus, with law enforcement trying tactics they had never rehearsed. Finally, a small group of police and armed civilians fought their way up and shot Widman dead. The attack was over. The nightmare was not. The UT Tower shooting would become a reference point for every campus shooting that followed. It raised unsettling questions. How do you police a campus? Who should be armed? What does security even mean in a place built on openness? While the country fixated on rare, spectacular violence, the everyday crimes on campus stayed mostly in the shadows. Dorms were often easy to access. Doors didn't always lock properly. Visitor policies were loose or non-existent. Burglaries, assaults, and sexual violence were often handled quietly. Administrators worried about reputation. Police didn't always have clear jurisdiction, or they didn't prioritize campus cases. Students were left to warn each other, if they were warned at all. There were no federal laws yet forcing universities to publish crime statistics. No standardized system of campus alerts. If you were a student in that era, you might know the campus felt unsafe. But the institution itself didn't have to admit it. By 1968, the United States was in turmoil. The war in Vietnam escalated. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. Cities burned. Trust in government collapsed. On campuses, politics stopped being a side conversation. It became the main event. Most student protests were peaceful. Some turned chaotic, and a few slid into outright violence on both sides of the protest lines. May 4, 1970. Kent State University, Ohio. President Nixon had just announced the expansion of the war into Cambodia. Across the country, students erupted in protest. At Kent State, demonstrations turned into confrontations, burned ROTC buildings, broken glass, tension with local authorities. On May 4th, hundreds of students gathered again. Some were protesting. Some were just walking to class. To the National Guard troops on campus, it was a crowd to control. What happened next would be argued about for decades. Who gave the order? Was there confusion? Did anyone mean for it to happen? The National Guard fired into a crowd of unarmed students, some hundreds of feet away. 4 students were killed. 9 others were wounded. These weren't soldiers on a battlefield. They were college students on their campus. The Kent State shooting sparked a nationwide student strike. Hundreds of campuses shut down. Millions of students walked out. To some Americans, the students were out of control, and the Guard had acted in self-defense. To others, the shootings marked a line the government should never have crossed, firing live ammunition at its own children. 10 days after Kent State, another campus bled. This time, at a historically black college, Jackson State in Mississippi. In the early hours of May 15, 1970, police and highway patrol officers faced student protesters near a women's dormitory. There were claims of rock throwing, of insults shouted. A bottle was thrown. A car had been burned earlier that week. Officers opened fire, spraying the dormitory with bullets for several seconds. 2 students, Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green, were killed. Dozens were injured. Unlike Kent State, the Jackson State shootings did not dominate national headlines. Race, geography, politics, all played a role in how quickly the story faded. But on campus, the message was unmistakable. Being a student offered no special protection, especially if you were black, especially in the South. Not all campus violence came from the state. Some came from the students, or at least, from people who saw themselves as part of the same movement. It's just after 3 a.m., August 24, 1970. 4 men opposed to the Vietnam War park a stolen van loaded with a homemade bomb outside Sterling Hall at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Their target, the Army Mathematics Research Center housed in the building, an academic link to the U.S. military. Their plan, hit a symbol of the war machine when no one was supposed to be inside. The bomb tore through Sterling Hall. Glass shattered, rooms collapsed, shock waves rolled across the sleeping campus. 33-year-old physics researcher Robert Fasnacht was working late in a basement lab, finishing an experiment before taking time off with his family. He was killed in the blast. Several others were injured. The Sterling Hall bombing was one of the most destructive domestic attacks on a university in American history. What began as a protest against war had become a war of its own, with innocent casualties. The bombing divided the anti-war movement. Many who opposed the draft and the war recoiled from deadly violence. Was this resistance or terrorism? Was the campus still a place for ideas, or had it become a battlefield? Groups like the Weather Underground and other radical organizations saw universities as part of the power structure they wanted to challenge. Sometimes that meant burning a ROTC building. Sometimes it meant planting bombs, usually at night, with warnings, but not always with predictable outcomes. By the early 1970s, bomb threats and suspicious packages had become part of campus life in some places. Fire alarms rang in the middle of the night. Students trooped out of dorms, half awake, never quite sure if this one was real. Even as radical violence made headlines, most campus crime stayed smaller in scale and largely invisible to public debate. Alcohol and drugs flowed more freely. Some students used the cover of political chaos as an excuse for personal violence. Sexual assault, rarely discussed openly, remained underreported and often mishandled. Without systematic reporting, it's hard to know how dangerous campuses really were in those decades. What we do know is that the people living there often didn't feel safe, no matter what official statements claimed. By the late 1970s, the most explosive years of campus unrest had passed. The draft ended. The war wound down. Many students shifted their attention from street protests to careers, families, and new cultural battles. But the memories didn't vanish. At these sites, the trauma remained etched into brick and concrete. Every new generation of students had to walk past places where earlier students had died. Before the 1960s, campus security was often minimal. Night watchmen, maybe a small security staff. The wave of protest, violence, and high-profile crimes forced universities to reconsider. More universities created their own police departments with sworn officers. They invested in radios, patrol vehicles, better lighting, and sometimes new surveillance technology. Policies shifted. Dorm access became more controlled. Visitor rules grew stricter. Security awareness campaigns encouraged students to lock doors, travel in groups, and report suspicious behavior. But attitudes didn't change overnight. Many administrators still preferred to downplay crimes, worried about bad publicity scaring off students and donors. It would take another tragedy in the 1980s and a new law to fundamentally change how campuses reported crime. Looking back at the 60s and 70s, we can name the big events. The Tower in Austin, Kent State, Jackson State, the Sterling Hall bombing. But beyond those headlines, there were thousands of smaller incidents, many never logged in any public records. Sexual assaults handled in-house, if at all. Hate crimes dismissed as pranks. Harassment, stalking, dangerous hazing rituals, drug-related violence, all filtered through a university's desire to avoid scandal. Survivors of these crimes weren't just statistics waiting to be discovered. They were people who carried the cost for the rest of their lives, often without recognition, without justice, and without a paper trail. Today, when a campus crime makes national news, it's often framed as part of a frightening new trend. But for anyone who studies history, there's another way to see it. Crime on campus is not new. Political violence on campus is not new. What's changed is how we see it, and how we record it. In the 1990s, the Jean Clary Disclosure of Campus Security Policy and Campus Crime Statistics Act, better known as the Clary Act, would force universities to collect and publish crime data. That law came too late for the students of the 60s and 70s. They lived and died in an era when fear and danger were very real, but the paperwork was optional. For some, the campus was a place of loss. A roommate killed in a shooting. A friend injured in a bombing. A classmate arrested and never seen again on campus. For others, it was a place of awakening. A realization that the police could be both protectors and aggressors. That institutions could both educate and silence. That safe spaces might not be safe for everyone. Campus crime in the 60s and 70s wasn't just about numbers or headlines. It was about the way fear seeped into everyday student life, and about the courage it took to stay, to study, and to speak out anyway. First, universities are not bubbles. They exist inside the political and social storms of their time. When a country is at war, divided over race, or caught in upheaval, the campus will feel it. Sometimes, the campus will become the place where those tensions explode. Second, security without transparency is not enough. In the 60s and 70s, many universities tried to manage crime quietly. They worried more about image than about data. Today's rules forcing public reporting exist because that approach failed the students who lived through those years. Third, the loudest crimes are not always the most common or the most destructive. A bombing, a shooting, a riot, these events grab attention. But the daily reality of assault, harassment, and fear, uncounted and often unspoken, can be just as devastating. If you walk across a college campus today, it might feel safe. Safer, perhaps, than it's ever been. That sense of safety is partly an illusion. But it's also the result of decades of hard lessons. Lessons written in shattered glass and burned buildings. In protest songs and grief-stricken silence. In laws passed because of lives lost. The students of the 60s and 70s never got to read a campus crime report with neat charts and official warnings. What they got instead were experiences that forced the rest of us to rethink what a university should be responsible for. Behind every quiet quad and clean brick facade, there's a history. A history that includes not just lectures and diplomas, but also sirens, gunshots, shattered doors, and whispered warnings. University campus crimes in the 1960s and 70s were not accidents of history. They were the product of a society in conflict, of institutions that didn't yet know how, or didn't want, to protect their students, and of young people who refused to stay quiet. The campuses we know today are built on that legacy. Safer in some ways, still vulnerable in others, and always just one decision away from becoming a crime scene, a protest line, or a place where history changes course again. The question is not whether crime can happen here. It already has. The question is whether we will remember what happened, and whether we'll act differently. Because they were here before us,